Hello, this is a brief talk I wanted to give on some reflections on Confucius thoughts and why I still think it's a relevant thing for today. And this is a talk that I've called The Sacred Bonds, although that's backwards. As Confucius taught, there are many sacred bonds within our lives. These many relationships, different as they are, entwine to give life meaning. There are many relationships of importance in our lives, but some perhaps are more important. That of our parents, a parental relationship to a child, those of our partners, those of siblings and friends, that of the doctor to a patient and a teacher to a student, or of authority in general to its subjects. Ultimately, the relation of the created being to the creator is what is of most importance to those with a theological belief. To a humanist, they might prefer to think our relations to our ideals are what's most important. Difficulties arise when these various relationships can become fractured, when a parent is abusive to their child, or when the child is rebellious to a good parent or benevolent parent. When a teacher deliberately gives his students false information or challenges that are either too hard or too lenient, or when a student perhaps disrupts a classroom of well-intentioned students and teacher, when a patient pretends to be sick or exaggerates their conditions, or even pretending to be better than they are, or when a doctor doesn't believe a patient who's being honest with them, who is genuinely sick, when a friend lies to you or betrays your trust, or when a partner has an affair behind your back, when we as citizens try to deceive the authority and play the system, or if the authorities deceive their own citizens. If we are in denial of how we live compared to our ideal self, then there will be problems. If we try and fool God and cannot receive wisdom from God from a theological point of view. Relationships can be on a scale. Sometimes they can be very good, mostly founded on trust, which relies on truthful accounts. But some relationships can, of course, be very bad, mostly founded on mistrust, fueled by suspicion, deception, paranoia, perhaps, or even accurate thoughts where deception really has happened. But they can also be somewhere in the middle, where the relationship may be partly true, but also partly false. There may be times when we don't know the state of the relationship. There may be uncertainty and doubts. Someone may have a long history of making incredible claims, which we may be uncertain about. Have they lied to us, or is it paranoia? Or could such incredible things be true, even if the odds seem stacked against it? Many people lack some of the sacred bonds. Either they've had bad experiences or have had no experiences. This can create hardships in life, depending on our needs. But we often do have some of the sacred bonds. It's quite rare to find somebody that has no bonds and no relationships, or that they would all be ill-founded. No one has all of their bonds, all in perfect conditions, all of the time. Well, maybe they have, but that must be rare and I haven't yet met them. And even when you may not have other human bonds, when they have perhaps broken down, still, there are your ideals. And, of course, God, which are the only real constants, of course, in life, since all other relationships can change for better or for worse. But, of course, our relationship to our ideals, to God as well, this, of course, can vary too, depending on our own position and how we are and how honest we can be. Of course, your ideals might change, but the ideals themselves do not, only your knowledge of them. So something like honesty itself always remains the same thing. It's the same kind of principle as it was thousands of years ago, as it is now. But our understanding of it and our ability to be it and our understanding of when and how we should do it, that of course itself can change. Our knowledge of it changes. This is an ideal situation where one would be brave, kind, and true. But who can do that all of the time? Our appreciation of these values changes, even if the actual values themselves are constants. But equally true, theologically, our knowledge of God can change, but that doesn't imply that God itself is changing, because the world doesn't revolve around us. God is as loving, just, and majestic today as thousands of years ago, but our understanding can change. People can live without parents. It's quite possible, and many people do. They may have friends that tend to become more parental or understand their immature nature because they didn't have people to nurture them or discipline them. And it does have an effect. If you don't have that sacred relationship and an absence of it, then you are going to suffer from that. You aren't going to have that same kind of nurturing. And so you're not going to grow as well. It's really like a plant that lacks water or sunlight or doesn't have the right type of soil. So it doesn't have the right conditions to grow and thrive as one might expect it to. And when we lack a certain relationship, especially like a parental one, that's so vital and important to our sustainable growth, then we tend to look for those relationships in other people. It could be in a friend, perhaps, that we look up to parentally and we look to for that nurturing or discipline. But it's true in all different relationships, of course. A patient who lacks a doctor, who may be very ill, but may still be learning as a student from a teacher who cares. So we may be looking to get a medical advice, if we don't have a doctor, from others, from a friend, from a parent, to make up for that which we are lacking. And it may be that one relationship compensates for another, therefore. Think of an uneducated student who may have parents, or a doctor, indeed, who tries to educate him because he doesn't have a teacher that can do this. A man without friends may have a friendly teacher, a teacher who, recognising that they're quite alone, becomes closer to that student, recognising that they need to have a mentor or someone to assist them. And a partner may indeed become like a best mate or confidant. So often when we are missing one or many of those sacred bonds, we will try to compensate this by allowing the other relationships that we do have to fulfill those missing roles, however flawed that sometimes may be, since nature abhors a vacuum. A friend pretending to be a parent, if well-intentioned, even if they are poor in the role, is still preferable to having none at all. It can be that we include another special bond, that indeed of the stranger, one stranger to another stranger, something that we all encounter. In fact, the vast majority of the world are strangers, and even the other sacred bonds were at some points. So it's from a stranger that we become acquainted, and from an acquaintance that we become familiar. And it's in these encounters with strangers that we meet what our relation is to the mass of humanity, to the great citizenship of people. This can vary greatly, of course, depending on our own circumstances, and will, of course, also be influenced by all the other bonds that we have in our life, however mended or fractured they may well be. When we talk about a doctor, this can have different meanings, of course. Generally, we do assume a physician, a doctor of the physical body, and there is a special intimate relationship between the doctor and patient, and the doctor needs correct information to make a diagnosis of the patient, or to be given a fair chance at least of that. It's not always easy to make an accurate diagnosis, but it's certainly much more easier if you do have accurate information. Of course, there is also the doctor of the mind today, and the relationship between a counsellor or psychiatrist and the patient is a very intimate one, and its success is equally dependent on the honesty and the competency also of the professional. And that relationship can be a very deep one, where you're sharing very intimate secrets, you're confiding things about your childhood, and you're talking also about things in the future, and about things that you wouldn't naturally want to talk to anyone about, but things that can be of a sensitive nature, and also can involve a certain amount of bravery in exposing yourself as being vulnerable and your flaws of where you've gone wrong. And also, of course, this involves recognizing mistakes in the present and our need to change for the future. And of course, one might consider a third doctor, a doctor of the soul. Many people might seek a theologian to guide them in various spiritual matters, be it a vicar, rabbi, imam, or priest, or even a shaman, or whatever persuasion one feels called to. Some people that don't have these doctors may use them, may use the other relationships in their lives to doctor them instead. They may look for that spiritual, that mental or physical guidance from other people that they do feel close to. It may even be strangers that they find it from. What happens if all of our bonds are broken? In such a breakdown where we may lose all of these bonds, either in losing touch with all people or having all of the relationships becoming destructive or mistrusting, then one might feel and be alone. It can be at this time, though, that one cannot cope and feels alienated. One might even find at this time that the belief in God still persists, and that God will never deceive us, and that with effort our relationship to God needn't break down, even if we and others do. One might come to see God as our parent, as our friend, as our doctor, our teacher, our partner. We may make vows to, and as our authority. However, whilst a person can live without such sacred human bonds, it is preferably not the ideal, though. There is much pain in a prolonged absence. We ideally should all seek to improve and strengthen our bonds with others, and to seek foundations where the relationships thrive, with the foundations of honesty and trust and sincerity. These are my reflections because Confucius thought that a good society functions well when those various relationships are functioning together, and where they are thriving, and where those great many relationships, where they function well, then a strong and good and productive and wholesome society is what's developed from that. And Confucius very much saw the family as a central part, therefore, of any good society, and saw that as a crucial thing. The family, of course, involving a set of various relationships: the parent to a child, siblings, brothers, sisters, and of course the husband to a wife, or a partner to another partner. So all these relationships he saw as fundamentally important for any good, thriving society to maintain. I myself don't necessarily feel that it has to be a blood relation in the family. I feel that family today, for many people, can be a transient sort type of family, so that we can find brothers who are really friends, and our acquaintances can become like our family because we know them in a deep level. We've spent so much time and energy with them, so we feel like they are as good as family for us. But of course, the difference is that with blood relations, we're more tied to them. It's more consistent. Although we might not see them for a long time, we have the same biological mother, the same biological brothers, and that doesn't change. And there's a good thing in that in terms of consistency and a continuity. But of course, the bad point of that is that it is inflexible, and that are we with the people purely out of choice, or is it just duty? Are we there with them because we have to be with them, we feel obliged to be? And there's a good thing in duty, in fact, and you feel that people have been placed into your life for a particular reason to learn from. But there's also a good thing in the fluidity and the transient nature of friendships. That strangers can become friends, and friends can become like family. And there's a good thing in this. I, in my own personal story, grew up with a foster family, and then later contacted my biological family. So it was really like having two different families, but also I felt sometimes having neither family sometimes, because they often moved around and I didn't see them a lot for years. So sometimes in the years without seeing them, I occasionally was adopted by other families, and there was a whole ready-made family that I would adopt. And although it didn't last, for its time, it was important, and I really felt those various relationships did provide me with the opportunities to learn in being an uncle to someone, where you're forced to parents and consider someone else's feelings more than your own sometimes, and to also be careful in your language of what you say to them and to be more thoughtful. It forces you to be more considerate and of someone's, especially someone who's young and impressionable. And of course, as well, I had many aunt figures and a grandparent figure, someone who would give me their advice from over the years, and someone who I would look up to and respect. And so I felt that it was really fascinating, and I thrived having these intimate relationships. It was a transient nature. I think one family I was with for about a year, perhaps two, a year and a half, and they were very intense relationships, in fact. And sometimes we argued savagely, and we mostly made up. Actually, we could be extremely nice to each other sometimes, and really awful as well. And I think that reminded me that family can have that double-edged sword thing about it. And sometimes it reminded me, when the arguments were bad, why I enjoyed being alone, and that was partly a choice. And that it's hard sometimes living intensely with someone for a long time. But during the nicer moments, when we shared time together, we shared meals, and we would share singing and partying and talking and swap stories. And it reminded me of all the happy times, and that I was glad and fortunate to have experienced some great times with people. So I had several families over the years that I was adopted by, and then it came to some sort of natural end where I left them and would then just see them very occasionally. And I think this is an experience probably of many people today, even if they do have a blood family. I think there's also transient families that they also would have, really, and that does tend to be more fluid. You know, you'll see someone for some months or but years and be very close, and then you may not see them again, or you may be parted and see each other just very rarely. So I think there are many different relationships in life, and I think the Confucius, what he had to say, is still relevant, and all these thousands of years on, is still something that's really important to us as individuals, but also to society, and it's something that I want to look into more. And I find that there's actually a whole area within his philosophy of how it also relates to other belief systems, and how in general it can be applied in simple terms, and how we choose to relate to people, and how conscious we are of the importance of even the small relationships, and how all those small relationships are what actually makes the whole picture work together. It's the small little nuts and bolts that make the giant machine operate properly, even though the tiny little things seem relatively obscure and unimportant, but actually it's all the really huge number, the massive number of all the really small little bits and pieces that all make up the whole piece together, and that makes the whole of society, of course. And so I think there's a really fascinating area of study within that, within philosophy, within psychology and theology, and where those three areas all overlap. But it's not just a practical academic study, it's something that we have to learn to apply to our day-to-day life as well. It's something that we all learn, something that we all struggle with as well. And that's pretty much the end of my thoughts on that. But I might come back to sort of look at it more. But I really am interested as well what others think about that, and whether they think those relationships are that important, and whether there are other, sacred relationships that perhaps I didn't cover as much of. And I guess there may well be a landlord to his tenants. I don't know. It's possible. An employer to his employee, a manager to his workers. That's a really important one too. And I hadn't just come into my mind that. And I'm sure there's a lot of other relationships too that make up the whole situation more. I suppose in terms of when you're working, your customer or your client, of course, is of real importance as well. So that wasn't an exhaustive list. It's just meant to be a sort of a brief reflection on its. So there's a lot more to say, and I think it's a study that merits looking into a lot deeper, really, and a fascinating area. And I think no matter how many thousands of years go by, good thoughts that are based on solid ideas that have got morally justified reasons behind them have still got relevance because they're universals, and because it doesn't matter, therefore, what continent or what century you happen to be living in. Those things, if they have got good credentials, can still be applied in our day-to-day life, wherever, however, or whoever we happen to be. I just off the top of my head, I suppose there's so many other relations, aren't there, really? A prisoner to his other prisoners, and to his jailer. I suppose that's another one that's important. The police officer, of course, or investigating officers, to various suspects or to victims of crime, indeed. So, there's so much more to that. I've just merely skimmed over the surface, but I wanted to cover just what I considered the most important of relationships. But there's a lot more to it than that. And I hope it encourages others to go out and to look into it and to investigate matters more as well.